right, welcome back to our daily read aloud. We are done with My Side of the Mountain. So today we are going to finish the Beatles book. All right, and if we finish the Beatles book, we'll see what we've got time for. So I am just going to kind of plow through this, read it a little more quickly. But the last thing we did talk about, we were just learning that, well, a few days ago, the Beatles had a little problem with making jokes that some people didn't think were funny, right? We kind of got over that. They quit playing concerts, and now the music they're making is so complicated they can't play it at a concert. They're playing things backwards. They're doing all sorts of things. And let's see, last thing. Okay, so they're back home with their families. And we were getting into the part where the Beatles were against the war. So they thought we don't need to be at war in Vietnam. And they weren't the only ones who thought that. So here's a little sidebar in the book about the Vietnam War. And Vietnam is a country near China. It's south of China. It's a very warm tropical climate. So here's a little about that. Why did the U.S. government send soldiers 10,000 miles away to Vietnam? Vietnam was separated into South Vietnam and North Vietnam. The government in North Vietnam was communist. South Vietnam was not communist. At that time, the biggest enemy of the United States was a communist nation, the Soviet Union, which is now Russia. So it used to be called the Soviet Union, which hoped to spread communism to other countries. The United States wanted to keep South Vietnam from becoming communist. So communist, what that means, it's kind of too complicated to get into it a lot. There are different types of government. We live in a democracy, but we have some like social programs, like do we all drive on the same roads? Right? Our roads, we all share them. We all pitch in and pay for them. So in some governments, everything in your country, everyone pays a lot more in taxes and everyone splits the cost of everything. So that is more like communism. So I'm not going to get too much into it, but you have less freedom, basically. By 1964, thousands of soldiers were fighting in Vietnam. The war dragged on for years. More than 50,000 American soldiers died before it ended. Okay, 50,000. At that point, that was a lot of people. It still is a lot. So our soldiers died for the war in Vietnam. North Vietnam won. Okay, North Vietnam was the communist nation, and they ended up winning. So the Vietnam War was one of those wars where we ended it, didn't feel really good about it. It took over South Vietnam, and it's still a communist country today. So even though we lost 50,000 people, nothing really good came out of that. So the Beatles were against that war. In 1967, a year after quitting the road, the Beatles released what many people think is their greatest album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And it's a funny name. What made Sgt. Pepper so special is how the Beatles used so many different styles of music on one album. John sparked controversy with the song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. People thought he was writing about drugs. Others couldn't figure out John's lyrics. But even the people who didn't understand the words could agree. The song was fun to listen to. Chapter 9, The Beginning of the End. In the beginning, the Beatles loved being a band. They loved being famous. They went from being 4 poor teenagers to world stars. Fans adored them, and they had more money than they could ever hope to spend. John bought a Rolls Royce. Does anyone know what that is?
Yeah, it's like
Eric?
A super luxury car.
It's a very fancy car. And fun fact, when I got married, my dad knew someone that had one, and when we left the church to go to our reception, we went in a convertible Rolls Royce. So I kind of connect to that car. Not that I'll ever have one, but I did ride in one. So John bought a Rolls Royce. It had a television and a refrigerator in it. All right, hold on one second. All right, sorry about that, guys. So it had a television and a refrigerator in it. Paul also bought a fancy car, an Aston Martin. Does anyone know what that is? It's another really fancy car. George got a house and had painters decorate it with flowers. When the money first began to pour in, I'd go and buy 10 suits, a dozen shirts, and 3 cars, Ringo said. I spent money like it had just been invented. As time passed, they began to see the sour side of being so successful, of being the Beatles. They were expected to spend all of their time together. They were friends, sure, but they were getting older. They had families now and didn't want to just hang out with the guys. So, slowly, they started to drift apart. They were already dressing differently. The times were changing. It would have been silly for the Beatles to show up in their matching colorless suits. The Beatles made sure to keep up with their latest styles. John let his hair grow long. He also grew a thick beard. He took to wearing a white suit, which we've seen in a lot of the videos. George and Ringo grew mustaches. Paul tried growing one, though he didn't keep it for long. They wore clothes with lots of style and lots of colors. This is how the hippies dressed. The band had done about 20 albums, more than 220 songs. Their next project was to record an album and make a movie at the same time. The idea was to show the world how the group worked so well together. Instead, Let It Be showed how tired the Beatles were of one another. Paul wanted to start playing concerts again, but nobody else did. George wanted more of his songs to appear on the album. The other Beatles said no. John wanted his new wife Yoko Ono at the recording studio all the time. The others didn't want her there. Yoko Ono was an experimental artist. She wasn't interested in drawing pretty pictures of flowers or of horses running through mountain streams. Her artwork was unusual, very unusual. For example, she once made a film of a fly walking up and down a person's body. Yoko also had very strong opinions. She thought the other Beatles should listen to John more. Well, why do you think she thought everyone should listen to John? Abby?
Because
Was he her husband? Yeah. So she's kind of turning into bossy pants. Lamb?
how much was the car?
Oh, I don't know. Back then, I don't know what it would be, but they are very nice, expensive cars.
Like 10,000.
Way more. Way more. Over 100,000. Okay, let's keep going. During the recording of Let It Be, Yoko sat next to John. She listened to the band discuss how to play the music. When there was a disagreement, she would whisper in John's ear or give her opinion to the group. She loved John and always took his side. The other Beatles thought that outsiders, even wives, didn't belong in the studio. It had always been just the four of them there. Let It Be turned into a big mess. By the end, the Beatles were barely talking to one another. They couldn't finish the album. When the movie was released, almost no one went to see it. The Beatles didn't even show up for the opening. Paul felt bad. He didn't want the band to break up like this. Yes, they had grown apart, but they still cared about one another. Paul convinced his bandmates to make one more album. This time, he said, there would be no fighting. It would be just like the old days. And it was. Josiah?
My neighbor has a Tesla,
Mhm.
and it's super cool. I've been inside of it. It has a video game like console inside.
That's pretty cool. All right, so their last album, and this should sound familiar to you. They named that album Abbey Road, after the address of their recording studio. So that's the one where the Beatles are walking across the street, right? We looked at that at the very beginning. That was their final album. Everyone, even Ringo, who didn't have a very good voice, got a chance to sing. Do you think that made everyone else feel better that wanted more of a chance to be involved? Yeah, everyone got to sing. The album was released, and almost immediately it went to #1 on the charts. Critics everywhere raved about its beauty. Then news came that stunned the world. It was over. The Beatles were breaking up. Chapter 10, Everyone is Going Solo. It was 1970, so this was 19 years before I was born, so it's not really that long ago. And they were no longer a band. But they were still musicians and still famous. Paul wanted to spend time with his family. He and his wife Linda, whom he married in 1969, bought a farm in Scotland. That's north of England. They had 3 children. One daughter, Stella, grew up to be a famous fashion designer. So Stella McCartney, if you ever want to look her up, that's his daughter. Paul made a solo album called McCartney. He played every instrument himself, including guitar, drums, and piano. Soon he started another band called Wings and played concerts again, which he'd always loved. Paul taught Linda, who was a photographer, how to play the keyboard for his band. That way, they would never have to be apart. George and Ringo were also busy making music. John and Paul had always been the lead songwriters in the Beatles. George and Ringo weren't allowed to sing much. Now they could make their own albums. George had so many songs saved up that when he recorded his album, it was longer than any of the ones released by the Beatles. In 1971, with his song My Sweet Lord, he became the first Beatle to have a #1 hit as a solo artist. And that is a good song. Yes.
I listened to My Sweet Lord.
Yeah, it's a good one. Do you like it? George Harrison, that's his most famous song.
When was the Beatles back on said one was shy.
That was George Harrison. So do you think by being in public and continuing to talk, do you think he overcame some of his shyness?
Yeah.
Probably a little bit. All right, so George Harrison wrote My Sweet Lord. It went to number 1. George also cared a lot about helping people in need. Once, he organized a giant concert to raise money for starving children in Bangladesh. That's another country kind of by Vietnam. He also produced movies, including Monty Python's Life of Brian. One thing about George never changed. So maybe, Angie, you're about to get to this. No matter how famous he was still shy. Even after all the tours, he was afraid to go on stage. He always had to be coaxed into playing publicly. He eventually bought a 100-room mansion in England. Did you guys hear that? A 100-room mansion in England with his second wife, Olivia, and their son, Donnie. A tall fence around it gave the family some privacy. It didn't keep out strangers, though. In 1999, so this was when I was about your age, I was 10, a man broke into their mansion. George was stabbed, but he recovered, and the man was arrested. So someone did try to kill George Harrison, but they were not successful.
Do you think it was one of the band members?
Probably not, no. The guy was arrested, so we could find out who he was. Ringo wasn't as successful a musician as George. Still, he loved being famous because it meant people would always laugh at his jokes, invite him to parties, and ask him to play concerts. He never liked arguing with his bandmates. Now he was happy to be at peace again. Ringo didn't have a good singing voice. His speaking voice, though, was very entertaining, particularly for younger fans. Ringo narrated a popular children's television show. You guys might know what this is, and you're going to be surprised. Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, and played Mr. Conductor on the Shining Time Station. So he was the narrator for Thomas the Train. Okay, that's Ringo's star. All right, let's read on. Let's read on. In 1973 and 74, Ringo had number 1 hits with Photograph and You're 16. He formed the All-Star Band, which continues to tour. In 2010, the year he turned 70, Ringo came out with a new album called Why Not? With a capital Y instead of the word Y. Liam?
Okay. Like, what do you mean when he was stabbed?
Like someone broke into his home and stabbed him with a knife. Tried to kill him. But he didn't, and the guy was arrested. Thank goodness. All right. John was probably the most glad to be free of the Beatles. Now he could say whatever he wanted about politics. Remember, he was the one that made the jokes that people were offended by. He and Yoko visited the United States often. John spoke out against the Vietnam War and people listened. He recorded a beautiful anti-war song called Give Peace a Chance. He and Yoko held many protests where they explained why they thought the war should end. Instead of a be-in, a large gathering of people, they held a bed-in, and we talked about that. That was their honeymoon. They wore pajamas and stayed in bed for 8 days as a protest. John and Yoko also rented big billboards that said, "War is over, if you want it." The American government wasn't happy about this. One senator from South Carolina, Storm Thurmond, wanted John kicked out of the country. The FBI started to follow John around, watching everything he did. Did John run back to England? No. He and Yoko moved permanently to the United States in 1971. They bought an apartment in the Dakota, a famous building in New York City. They would live there the rest of John's life. So, as John, Paul, George, and Ringo lived their lives apart from one another, one big question remained. When would the Beatles get back together? Cadence?
I was born in South Carolina.
Really? There you go. All right, shh. So when would the Beatles get back together? Never, was the answer, John said. Some of them did work together, but never all 4 at the same time. George played with John and Ringo on their albums. Ringo played on John's, on Paul's, and on George's albums. Paul played on George's and on Ringo's albums. And John played on George's and on Ringo's albums. So mostly they continued to play together, right? Just they all 4 couldn't get together anymore. Why didn't the group ever have a reunion? Mainly because John and Paul were too mad at each other. So John and Paul is really the reason why they broke up. Now, listen. In fact, after the Beatles broke up, John and Paul said hurtful things about each other in public. John even made fun of Paul's new music in the song How Do You Sleep? In 1972, 2 years after the breakup, John and Paul started talking again. And there was one night that they almost performed. It was in 1975 on a Saturday night when Paul happened to be in New York City. He went over to John's apartment and they watched some TV. The comedy show Saturday Night Live was on. Strangely that night, the show's producers offered to pay the Beatles $1,000 each if they would reunite for the program. It was a joke. People in the audience laughed because the Beatles had already been offered more than $1 million to play together again. Paul and John thought it would be funny to show up at the television studio and surprise everyone. In the end, they stayed in John's apartment. But fans still talk about what it would have been like had they sung together just one more time. And Chapter 11, The Saddest Day. By the mid-1970s, John Lennon was still one of the most famous people in the world, more so than any of the other Beatles. Was he happy? No. He was still a young man, only in his mid-30s. So when you're thinking about this, he's like my age now. John Lennon. Okay, we're talking about John now, and he's about my age. He'd spent so much time in the spotlight. He never seemed to ease with himself, even at home. His marriage to Yoko Ono was breaking up. John was afraid it would end in divorce, just as his first marriage had. Eventually, Yoko asked John to move out. He agreed, though he didn't want to. John began to drink too much. He also took drugs again. He started hanging out with people who only wanted to go to parties. He got into fights. His music suffered. Hey, what's going on here with John Lennon? Shh, we shouldn't talk unless I call on you. Zoe, what do you think?
He's breaking.
Yeah, it seems like he is breaking, right? Sometimes we might call this depression. He's on the wrong path, right, Josiah?
Yeah, he's like getting really upset.
Yeah, he needs something to make him feel better. Something that will work, right? Not drugs and parties and people that don't care about you. Angie, did you want to say something too? No? All right. Yoko reconsidered and asked John to come home. A few months later, Yoko told him she was going to have a baby. On October 9th, 1975, they had a baby boy and named him Sean. When John's first son, Julian, was born in 1963, John had been on tour a lot. This time, he would be a different kind of father. John wanted to stay home with Sean. He would learn how to change diapers. He would be there to see his baby's first steps. From now on, my chief responsibility is my family, he told reporters. Do you think that maybe spending more time with his family and getting back to that helped make him a happier person?
Yes.
Yeah. Noah?
What about his other kid? Did you never want to see him again?
He probably did. This book doesn't talk about it much, but I would assume he had a relationship with his son. I don't know. We'll have to look that up later. Okay. For him, this meant quitting music. John didn't record any albums or play a single concert while Sean was a baby. He was there in the morning when Sean woke up. He dressed Sean and played with him all day. John even learned to cook. He called his half-sister on the phone to tell her about his first day at trying to bake bread. He did such a bad job that when he tried to cut it, the knife bent. For 5 years, John almost never left his apartment. Music was still on his mind, though. Every once in a while, a new song would pop into his head. Not wanting to forget it, John would sit at his piano and play the song into a small tape recorder. Then he put the tape away for later. Lots of people, including other musicians, urged him to play concerts again or record. He kept saying no. But then suddenly, unexpectedly, he changed his mind. It wasn't because he needed the money. He was rich. It wasn't for attention. He had plenty of that. The reason John decided to go back was simply because he loved making music. It was a part of him that he couldn't ignore anymore. So when Sean was turning 5 and ready to start school, John went back to work. He didn't sign any recording contracts. He didn't hold a big concert. First, he needed to practice. He wrote and played test songs or demos by laying a tape recorder on top of his piano. Before long, he had more than enough songs for an album. The next step was to make the album. John started recording and asked Yoko to sing some songs on it too, even though he knew many of his fans would be upset. He called their album Double Fantasy. Some of the songs John recorded, Watching the Wheels and Just Like Starting Over, were about taking a break from music. Others were about his family. He wrote one about Sean called Beautiful Boy, and one about Yoko called Woman. The album came out on November 15th, 1980, and was a big success. So this was 9 years before I was born. It sold 500,000 copies in 2 weeks. And remember, this is before you could get it online, so that meant you went to the record store and bought the album. John was excited and looked forward to producing more music. Then, on December 8th, 1980, something happened that nobody alive at the time will ever forget. That afternoon, John and Yoko were walking outside their apartment on Central Park West. A man named Mark David Chapman came up and asked John to autograph his album. John liked doing this for fans. But Mark David Chapman wasn't like other fans. He was mentally ill. He heard voices in his head, voices that told him to hurt John Lennon. That evening, Chapman returned. He waited near the entrance of the Dakota. When John and Yoko arrived home, Chapman called out, "Mr. Lennon!" Then he took out a gun and fired. John Lennon, who hated violence, who didn't believe in the use of guns, fell to the ground. He died shortly after. He was only 40 years old. The world was stunned. New Yorkers came from all over the city to stand outside John's home. Some were in their pajamas crying. They left flowers. Strangers hugged one another. They sang John's songs. 6 days later, more than 100,000 people gathered in Central Park. So this is the park where I told you I saw his memorial. There were 10 minutes of silence. Then John's song, Imagine, played over loudspeakers. The song was his dream of peace. Imagine all the people living life in peace. John's death was a terrible tragedy, but it wasn't the end of what he stood for. He is remembered not only as a Beatle, but for trying to make a better world. In Central Park in New York, there is a mosaic circle with the word Imagine. It is a memorial to John Lennon. In 2010, okay, so this is not that long ago. Is that about the time you guys were born?
Yeah. I was born in 2011.
Okay. Okay, I can't hear you. Shh. I can't hear anything you're saying, so just keep in your head. This is about that time you were born. 30 years after his death, huge crowds came, as they do every year on December 8th, and left flowers for John. Imagine remains a song for peace. That's why Neil Young chose to sing the song on television just days after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Why do you think that song would have been a good one to play after the terrorist attacks? Madeline?
Because it wasn't peace.
Liam?
I was gonna say, so who shot in his house?
Outside his house. He was walking down the sidewalk to go home.
Told you.
Okay, so my question though was, this song, they chose to play his song Imagine on television. There was a big concert trying to basically let the nation grieve together after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And they played his song. Why do you think they played that song? Noah?
Because imagine a world of peace, and they wanted to say you guys didn't do anything, and we're gonna have more peace now.
Yeah, that is kind of how it was. You know, that was a terrible thing. I was in 6th grade when 9/11 happened. I was in class. I remember exactly who I was sitting near. I know what my teacher said to us. It was a scary day. We all didn't know if there were going to be more plane crashes. That's what you felt in that moment. So the whole country was scared, confused, sad. We don't want more violence. So that song kind of helped bring everyone together. So John Lennon really is known for his love of peace, his desire for peace for everyone. And so people talk about him a lot when we talk about peace. Madeline?
I have an answer about the Twin Towers from the book fair at my mom's house. And it said that Lauren Tarshish, I can't say her last name, but that made I Survive. She was on a plane to go to New York to see her family, and everybody was scared because the person just said on the microphone thingy that something happened and he'll tell them later. But then they told him that the terrorist attacks were there. But then everybody was scared on the airplane. But then they got back to where she started. But they couldn't go to see the family.
Good. All right. No stories. If this is about John Lennon or something about 9/11, real quick. But I got to finish the book. Liam?
What's 9/11?
September 11th, when the terrorist attacks flew the airplanes into the Twin Towers. We've talked about it some this year. Hayden?
And I think another reason because it wasn't really peace when, the person was, drunk or something when they...
You talking about John Lennon when he was making his bad choices?
No, the person who was driving the plane.
Oh. Well, they just made that choice on purpose. It was just a bad, evil thing to do. So the whole nation needed something to think about, we need peace. We need to keep positive. Noah, real quick.
Madeline always said she jumped off the Twin Towers.
Huh?
Madeline always said she jumped off
Okay,
the Twin Towers.
well, we don't need to repeat that right now. Shh, stop, guys. Not appropriate right now. Okay, I've talked about jokes about tragedies and all that. Not good jokes. Josiah, real quick.
My dad's still on top of the Twin Towers.
Really? Very cool. All right. So, 15 years after John's death, the three other Beatles did reunite. Remember those songs John wrote while Sean was a baby? Yoko had the demo tapes. So, all those songs he recorded he never published, but his wife still had the tape. So, even though he was dead, we still got some of those songs. She let Paul, George, and Ringo record their voices and instruments along with John's. In 1996, the first song, Free as a Bird, went straight to number 1 on the charts. Paul, George, and Ringo continued their separate careers. There were sad times ahead. Paul's wife, Linda, died in 1998. Their marriage had been a very happy one. Paul remarried in 2002, but split up 4 years later. Then George announced terrible news. He had cancer. He died in 2001. A year to the day of his death, Paul and Ringo gathered for a tribute concert to him in London's Royal Albert Hall. They played George's songs with other famous musicians and with George's son Danny, who was 24 at the time. The concert could have been very sad. After all, the musicians had lost one of their oldest, dearest friends. But instead, they were cheered by playing George's songs. At the end of the concert, flower petals slowly floated down from above onto the stage. To this day, the Beatles remain the most famous musical group in the world, which is a big deal, right? There's a lot of musicians. They're the most famous. Their songs have been recorded by everyone from legendary crooner Frank Sinatra to pop musicians such as U2 and Elliott Smith. In 2000, the Beatles' greatest hits collection, called One, went straight to the top of the charts, even though none of the songs were new. The Beatles are gone. John is gone. George is gone now too. But not the music. That will live forever. All right, I gotta go. See you tomorrow.